name of the one and only, we welcome you again to another session of the Indigo Firmament. We are continuing on the discussion of the perception of Islam through the course of history. In the previous program, we discussed how that perception changed in the periods of the Safavid Persia. We expanded that further into the competitiveness of the Safavid Persians, first as rivals of the Ottomans to their west, and then subsequently and in modern times, as I termed the Islamic Republic as the second Safavid Persia in this particular regard, and therefore just as the Safavid had a rival in the Ottomans, the Islamic Republic has a rival in the Saudi state of modern times. And just as the Safavids fought disaster wars in competing with the Ottomans, the modern state of Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Saudi state of the Arabian Peninsula are fighting devastating wars on several fronts, including those in Syria and in Yemen and perhaps in Afghanistan and Pakistan at a lower level with lower intensity wars. Nonetheless, they are wars, and perhaps in Iraq as well. Today, I want to turn the attention of the audience to yet a different aspect of the perception of Islam through the course of history discussion. And that has to do with the West. Yes, we have made references to the West before, but let me discuss this more in the context of a sidebar, a detour, because we need to have a better understanding of what factors were involved in the period after the 1500s or circa 1500s, and how that affected global politics, but particularly the relationship between the Muslim East and the Christian West, as it's often named and perceived in those terms. The end of the 15th century resulted in the discovery of the Americas. 1492, Christopher Columbus, Age of Discovery, and all that. But there was also that very fact also contributed to a different dynamics at the global level, but in particular those between the Muslim lands or the Muslim East and the Christian West. So let's identify each for what they were and how they were. In circa the turn of the 15th century, we had the formation of the Safavid Persia in what is modern day Iran, and the establishment of the Mongol state in India. And as the Timurids were declining and the Shaybanids were sustaining themselves, eventually the Afghans formed their state of what is modern Afghanistan. We had other smaller states in the rest of the Muslim world, but most of the centerpieces were then, of course, controlled by the Ottomans. In their minds, the Muslims felt like they were still the dominant power in the world. Yes, they had these huge empires. By the standards of those days, their economies were in good shape, and the formation of these new states must have added an additional thrust to that development, economical or cultural and otherwise. So they felt they were in the driver's seat. They felt very comfortable. But that was very deceiving, because unbeknownst to the majority of the Muslims in North Africa, Middle East, South Asia, and the rest, and East Africa, Europe was waking up. On the opposite side, in respect to Christian West, and I'm talking primarily about Europe, there was there were several factors. In a way, they were triggered by excursions or incursions into the Muslim lands through the Crusader period, as well as through the Iberian Peninsula, that Europe suddenly became aware, or rather gradually became aware, of what was out there that they were deprived of. And that Europe, which felt very isolated because it was surrounded by Muslim lands from the east and the south and southeast, felt like they could probably break away from this isolation. This we can contribute to several factors which happen to be the basics of what we know today as the West, by which we mean the Western civilization. If we look at the long-term history, for the earlier civilizations, say in China, in India, and including those of the Islamic civilization, the rate of progress of making connections between inventions and discoveries and sciences and arts was gradual and slow. In a way, we could say easily that time was moving rather slow for the Chinese. It would have probably taken several centuries for the Chinese to, say, invent the gunpowder, to invent, which for them, by the way, was not gunpowder, it was an explosive powder. It became gunpowder subsequently. So the rate of progress of raising China from a scattered states that at some point were brought together and unified into a big empire and a bigger empire, and then this empire following the path into a civilizational powerhouse would have taken many centuries for China. Then subsequently, in the case of India, perhaps it happened in a shorter period of time, because time would have been now moving faster, and the Chinese civilization was Chinese in character, basically, and if it had a collaborative element to it, they were still Chinese of the north and the south, and whether it was from Nanjing to Beijing and elsewhere, it was still Chinese. Whereas in the case of India, now we are talking about this later period of their civilizational glory, pre-Columbian and during the Christopher Columbus period. This would have been a cumulative, integrative, and inclusive, that India was not progressing just as Hindus or Indians, but rather as Hindus and Muslims, and say Indians and say Afghans and Persians and Central Asians and Arabs and so on. So in that sense, then India had an element that the Chinese civilization didn't have. In other words, there was more of a cultural diversity in which people brought their own creations and inventions and discoveries, and and contributed to the growth and development of what eventually became known as the Indian civilization, which at its highest point was made India as the hub, or rather the focal point for anyone who wanted to be anywhere they wanted to be in India. Of course, we know this from the earlier stages of the Age of Discovery, when Europeans, including Columbus, they all wanted to go to India. So there had to have been a reason, and that was that India was a superpower at the time. So again, this would have happened at a faster pace. And I'm thinking that during the Islamic period in, say, Baghdad and Damascus and Istanbul and Isfahan, there too the rate of progress would have been a little faster. But none of these would have been as fast as those that happen in the West. So, again, just a reminder that I'm trying to explain the rise of the Western civilization, which I believe was responsible for various reasons, including cultural, religious, and otherwise, or ideological, that contributed to the negativity of the image of Islam and the perception of Islam, at least from the Western perspective, which has now become a global phenomenon. So that is the goal, the main objective of where this discussion is being directed to. So the progress towards a new civilizational force in Europe, which we know today as the Western civilization, is the result of several factors. One would be the Age of Discovery, that the Europeans finally figured out how to break these, break away from this geographic isolation, which was both cultural and geographic. So the Age of Discovery was the main thing. Along with the Age of Discovery came a new phenomenon unknown to humanity up to that point, and that is the Age of Colonialism. That yes, when these lands were discovered, the Europeans had this obsession with claiming them as theirs, sticking their flags on every shore that they reached, whether it was in Africa and in Asia or in the Americas. And that resulted in colonialism. And colonialism, again, has its different phases, which we'll go to, but let me give you the outline. The third aspect of that would have been the Industrial Revolution, which, of course, contributed to the rise of Western civilization. And then the Age of Enlightenment. So if we line it up, we are talking about four major factors, and I'm sure there were others. The Age of Discovery, colonialism, Industrial Revolution, and the Age of Enlightenment. And so let's discuss each one in detail. We say that Europe was isolated in that corner in the northwest, in that subcontinent called Europe, which was not very hospitable. It didn't have friendly environment, or the climate was cold. Food resources were often, there was shortage. Diseases, whether they were plagues or malarias or others, developed a lot in Europe, and Europeans suffered greatly from it, as there were some of these, like the Plague of London, that claimed the lives of, if not tens of thousands, certainly hundreds of, if not hundreds of thousands, at least tens of thousands of people. So this was Europe. Now, what happened in the age of discovery, that this very nature of this cold, unfriendly, isolated, geographic nature of Europe somehow turned to become an asset and turned to become positive. And the positivity came from the following, that most European cities and then subsequently city-states were cities that were built on the bend of a river. London on Thames, Paris or Seine, Frankfurt am Main, as they say in German. So these cities were built around the bend of a river to have an access to water, which is the nature of hydraulic society. So these formations would have been much, much earlier than the period of time that we are discussing. But now in the age of discovery, it connected these cities through the river navigation onto the open seas. And the rugged and jagged coastline of Europe, which was seen as a negative before, all of a sudden became a positive, because it turned many European cities, especially port cities such as Hamburg and many of the cities in, say, Lisbon and on the Iberian Peninsula, Marseille and Venice and so on, all of them now had this great advantage of being connected to the open seas, because now the Europeans can sail on to other lands. And so in a way it turned every European country, or provided a potential for them to contribute to the discoveries of this the age of discovery. The Dutch, a very small country, but having Amsterdam and Rotterdam and all these, it's called as the Netherlands or the lowlands, because most of its land is below the sea level, and therefore their access to the water enabled them to participate in these foreign excursions. And of course the other did as well. But if you look at the global map of the age of discovery, that the contributions weren't made just by the Spanish and the Portuguese, although that they were the ones who started it, again on an order from the Pope. But after these vanguard Portuguese and Spanish sailors that sailed around the world, we had the Dutch, then we had the British, and we had the French, and the rest of the European countries, one after another, the Belgians. And at the end result, when the age of discovery slowly turned into the age of colonialism, you can look at the map of the world, especially in Africa, where even to this day, Africa has lost its character, in the sense that you go to Angola, they speak Portuguese. You go to Congo, which was Belgian, they speak French. And you go, say, to Nigeria, English, and Algeria and Tunisian, Morocco, French, and Italy, in in Ethiopia and Libya, and so on and so forth. So in other words, the rest of the world, particularly Africa, became virtually the backyard, not geographically, but in terms of the colonial policies for these European states. So the age of discovery would have been a positive development as far as Europeans are concerned. But there was a great negative, and the negative affected the Muslim lands primarily. And that was that in the Muslim lands, economies, trade business, cultural exchange, and all that was more a land-centered state, or a land-centered commerce. They had developed what is known as the Silk Road to connect China to the Middle East, or they had built the great Grant Road in northern India, which kind of unified northern India economically. So for the most of these Muslim lands who were oriented towards a land-centered culture, developing caravanserais and highways and byways, that focus somehow shifted very drastically. And in the age of discovery, now when the Europeans wanted to go to these foreign lands, and they were of course going by ships, navigating the great seas, they were doing it with much, much more ease. They didn't have to build these highways and byways. The sea was an open sea. All they had to do was to build their ships and sail on. Again, the negatives of Europe was all turned into a positive in the age of discovery, as the focus from land-centered economies turned into a sea-centered or sea-based economies. We then moved to the age of colonialism, and in the age of colonialism, again, I've talked about this before, that the deprivation of food and spices and other resources in the isolation of Europe, geographic isolation as much as cultural, resulted into a full-fledged expansion and exploration for resources, for food types. Remember, Columbus wanted to go to India to get spices, but it wasn't just spices they wanted. And they had abundance of other things, silk, jute, other products, linen, cotton, and so on. All of these were part of another world, of another ecosystem, of another culture, and now the Europeans wanted them. There wasn't a problem with them wanting these. The problem began when they decided to own these. And when you decide to own, they didn't know where to start. And by that I don't mean that they didn't have the knowledge, that they were at a loss as to how to proceed it. And eventually it resulted in trying to own the land, to own the government, to control everything possible. The human resources, slavery and all that, natural resources, mines and whatever they could, industrial resources, economic resources. They were controlling trade, they were controlling products, and so on and so forth. So this is the character of colonialism. So when the British went to India, for example, during that first period of what we could probably call the first stage of globalization. To a lot of people, globalization is a rather modern phenomenon. But I think that the first globalization occurred during the earlier stages of colonialism. In respect to India alone, we saw that there was a Dutch company, that there was the East India Company, a British company. There was a French company called, I think, Pondicherry, that was operating in the Bay of Bengal. So all of these were trying to present themselves more as trade posts for Western countries, and keeping them in that respect, or just with that limited scope of their existence at the time, that seemed rather innocent. That didn't seem threatening. That didn't seem empowering or imposing or intruding Yes, these are European companies that wanted to trade and business, to come to these lands and do trade and business. And perhaps many people in India would have looked at it positively because they brought new products and new things, and they became buyers for some of the Indian products. So that would have been a positive. What happened subsequently, whether by design or by progression of an expansive policy, was that these posts had to be protected. And that is a key word in both colonialism as well as in imperialism. And of course, we can look at imperialism as a stage of colonialism, both from Marxist perspective, but also from philosophical perspective. And the reason I didn't classify it as separate, because I see it as part and parcel of a colonial policy. So eventually they needed to protect their trade outposts. And for that, obviously, they needed some soldiers. And if the soldiers had to go, well, there was a potential for some missionaries to go along too, because they were the ones who knew languages, so they could translate, so they could connect and communicate with people. So a combination of a statesman and soldier and a missionary and a businessman. So in all these forms, these are the faces of colonialism as they encountered cultures of the East. Let me repeat one more time. There's the face of the businessman, the merchant, the European merchant that wants to trade. Then there is the face of this European soldier with some kind of funny-looking uniform and all that, who have come legitimately sounding claim that they're protecting their trade posts. Then comes then even more funny-looking dressed clergy who, of course, in the long run wanted to convert people into Christianity, but perhaps initially they wanted to know about the religion and the people and the language of the locals. And then, of course, there are the statesmen, the politicians, who would have to endorse this whole venture with its multifaceted objective in the long run. So this is how they initially started, and eventually, as the needed for their quote-unquote security more areas to expand to, and by virtue of that necessity sometimes to include and buy properties, lands, and parcels and all that. And then these had to be defended and protected. And so the role of the military increased, and the role of the statesman increased. And of course, the clergy and the missionaries went their own ways. And so slowly but surely, they took over most of these lands. Take the Dutch, who controlled all of Indonesia, a country of several thousand islands. And by control, I mean the Dutch controlled their economy, their produce, whatever they were making, their handicrafts and all that, and did trade, which obviously they paid either minimum or didn't pay anything to the Indonesians, and in turn they would sell whatever they got from there and enrich themselves. This is the age of colonialism. So as you can see, it is a progression from the age of discovery, which is only to find lands, cities, port cities that are there, the age of colonialism, where you take these trade posts to have them established, and the age of imperialism, which is then you have to send armies to defend and protect them. And then eventually you end up taking over all these countries. Like I said, all of Indonesia becomes a Dutch colony, India becomes a British colony, and so on. That I don't need to explain to you, but this is how that part of it works. Now, at the same time, there is what is called the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And this Industrial Revolution was, again, not an isolated incident, but a part and parcel of this colonial imperial policy of the West. You can develop an industry. The invention itself is fine, but the invention itself is not going to put food on the table unless that which you have invented has a use to produce certain things. And then what you have produced will not get anywhere unless you can sell it. And the way colonialism contributed to the Industrial Revolution, or vice versa, was that what the Europeans produced had captive markets, if I can coin this term here. As now the British could produce a good quality product or even a questionable quality product, but they could always take it to some of these colonies, such as India, and sell it there. Now, if they took a particular British product to India to sell, well, we say that India was an industrialized country in its own terms and its own time. So then the European product may or may not have been competitive, or competitively produced, or competitively sold. So then you had to eliminate the competition. And who eliminates the competition? Those who had power. Who had the power in this stage? Increasingly, more Europeans had more power, and the local states were slowly, as they were in decline, they were losing more power. And so Europeans were, in a sense, creating a market. And in many cases, it will be monopolized. And in these monopolized markets, they were doing what is called in modern economics dumping initially, which is you take certain products and undersell it to a point that you can eliminate your competition. It may have cost you $10 to produce, but if in the local market, other similar products are sold for $5, you would have to sell yours for $4 or $3, dump it, take a loss initially. And this will drive people, it will draw people to your product, which would be of competitive or comparable quality, and yet it will be undersold. And once you draw customers to your product, the competition will collapse because nobody will buy theirs. And you would have subsidized your product through state or some other means. And once the once the competition is eliminated, then you can sell at a higher price, at a price that you will be now gaining back that which you have lost in the initial state. So these are technical descriptions of some of the policies that they employed in the colonial period. But the result was, as far as our discussion is concerned, that India, as a superpower of the world, as the most industrialized nation in the world, eventually became a basket case with the hunger, with starvation, with malnutrition, country that couldn't even sustain its own population in terms of food and nutrients and all that, because its products were, its industrial base was destroyed by the various colonial policies. I just explained only one of them. So this is the age of industrial revolution in Europe, and the industrial revolution in Europe moved faster because they had these markets and these had these policies that could be implemented. So long as you can sell, so long as the sale of your product is guaranteed, you don't have to worry about the quality, at least not in the initial stage, because you are now competing at the world stage, and your competition is tilted in your favor because of the military power that is kind of going alongside your trade and business policies. Then after the Industrial Revolution comes the age of Enlightenment, although these have a lot of overlapping, and that created more freedom of thought, freedom of expression, religious reformations, and many other things that I'm sure most of you know throughout history. Why are we discussing this? Because, as I said earlier, we are discussing this to build towards the perception of Islam after the 1500s. And as we saw this power shift, that the more advanced, economically advanced, culturally and civilizationally advanced countries of the Muslim Middle East are slowly declining in all those three aspects. As civilization force, they are declining. As industrial force, they are declining. And by contrast, Europe is advancing. And with this advancement, and as I said, compared to the rapid advancement that was in China, in India, and in the Muslim lands, European advancement happened rather rapidly. And the underlying theme here is as follows: that initial controversial or adversarial competition with the Muslim world, or between the Muslim East and the Christian West, was always there at the subconscious level. Let's put it that way. And so this opportunity of Europe evolving and developing into what today know as the Western civilization did not give up on their adversarial relationship with the Muslim lands. And as they had more power in the areas I just discussed, but in addition to that, what may have been a contributing factor, definitely in respect to the Age of Enlightenment, was that of the development of the press and the accessibility of the printed page, the book, the newspaper, and eventually the magazines and the media, is that this brought knowledge. It took it out from the pages of a book and made it not only available and expandable, but relevant to the daily life, that a daily newspaper or a weekly newspaper would be much more updated in terms of the events of the time, rather than a book that might have been printed years and decades earlier. And so this relevance, and rather cutting the time element, excluding it from this obsoletism of knowledge, in other words, making knowledge printable at the at the pace of daily events, resulted in much more communication. But also it would have played into the hands of the authority, who would have used these media for propaganda purposes against their enemies. And that's where in the context that the Muslim East and Christian West rivalry goes, then the media and the immediacy of the media was very critical, and they did turn the image of the Muslim world, and particularly the perception of Islam, into a greater negativity. We did talk in an earlier session of this program about, for instance, how the name and the image of the Ottomans and the Turks was turned negative, and when that negativity was popularized during the Age of Enlightenment, because there were the media, the print media in particular, was now came in very handy for these political objectives. And so therefore, perhaps not so much in the 1500s, but subsequently 1700s and in the course of time, the perception of Islam in Europe was very, very negative. What we see today as the reaction of the Europeans towards Muslim migrants from the Middle East has roots in the long history of that adversarial East-West relationship. So this is not just a modern-day phenomenon. We saw this, we have seen forms of these in different stages, including those that go back to, for instance, the time that the government of the Republic of Turkey applied for membership in the European community, and many European leaders came out right to state the fact that Europe was not a place for the Turks, for the Muslims, for the Islamic culture, and so on and so forth. Just that window during the rise of communism and its threat to the West, Muslims were kind of marginalized and pushed aside. They were no longer the focal point of this adversarial competition. But before that, this trend continued. So during the whole period, formative stage of the European civilization, age of discovery, colonialism, imperialism, industrial revolution, the age of enlightenment, during all these stages, that theme remained through and through in the mindset of the Europeans, to see Muslims as the villains, as the other, which of course had roots in the earlier European history. But the perception of Islam was certainly negative, and this negativity increased with time. Perhaps in the Age of Enlightenment, there might have been some degree of understanding that if you allow for a diversity of views, then yes, the diversity of views could be also in a religious context, and therefore just because Muslims have another religion, that does not necessarily mean that they have to be vilified. But that would have been the opinion of the scholars and the philosophers, who are always in the minority. But the states might find it more convenient to create more otherness, especially if you're eyeing their resources. And as far as that the resources goes, then we go on to the 20th century, where the resources that had previously devastated the economies of India, for example, or Indonesia or some other lands, now enters a different stage. In the earlier stage of colonialism, they were trying to create markets for the European products, and therefore do everything possible to destroy the industrial infrastructure of the non-European states. And this would result in trade and business that favored Europeans because they had subsidized and supported by the state and by the military. In the 20th century, the discovery of oil changed or raised this exploitative colonial policy to a different level. And that is that there was no longer any need for destroying the industrial infrastructure in the Muslim lands. And the main thrust of their policies, the colonial policies, was to take these resources out, the oil, and sell it, not just for their own needs, but also in the world market. And so we saw that there were companies such as the British Petroleum, for instance, or the other Western companies that were somehow involved. Since the West had the technological know-how and the political dominance on the world stage, and most of these Muslim countries were developing, or rather had remained underdeveloped, such as Iran and Arabia and so on. They were at the mercy of the West. They had no choice. They had no alternative because they themselves were not capable of extracting their own oil or refining them or marketing them. And so therefore they just became states that played a for lack of a better term, a managerial role. And that policy continues to this day. And the managerial role is that it is these Western companies that, through the full support of the states, because when, for instance, in modern context, we talk about American interests in the Middle East, we are talking about the interest of American corporations, oil companies, Exxon and the rest of them, who feel entitled to, there is a sense of entitlement to the resources in the Middle East. Now, before we go to this stage, let me precede this with another argument that in the context of this colonial policies, then it moved on to a new stage, and that was kind of the neo-colonial stage. Now, in the colonial stage, Western armies went and invaded many of these countries, basically looted their resources, destroyed their economic, industrial infrastructure, and that's how Europe became richer and the rest of the world was becoming poorer and poorer through this exploitation, which also, by the way, included the slave trade, which deprived Africa of yet another resource, which is the human resource. So all the able bodies, productive hands of Africa that could have developed Africa were brought over to the West, primarily to America, to some extent to Europe as well. So in that regard, then colonialism resulted in the impoverishment of the third world, Asia and Africa, and to some extent Latin America. So these resources that belonged to the people, that should belong to the people, or should belong to states that legitimately can utilize them and benefit its own citizens, became a source for the enrichment of big Western corporations, and in the process, the people of these lands became poorer and more destitute. And for these, of course, there was need for huge armies to be raised to protect them. And so long as there were armies in these foreign lands, that is generally the criteria by which we define the age of colonialism. The neo-colonialism is a development that it got to a point where European powers, and by powers I mean both corporations as well as states, became greedier, and yet they did not have quote-unquote the manpower to send that many armies abroad. So it moved to the next stage, and in the next stage they tried to create client states, what the communists and socialists called the compradors, or the people who would be compromising, or people who played as an instrument of the West, as dictators, simply put. And these dictatorships, in a way, replaced both Western armies and Western trade posts of the 17th and 18th century. In the sense that because dictators did not feel secure in terms of their own power, as the term dictator implied, that they were not legitimate leaders, and they did not come to power through elections, but rather by through military coups or installations by foreign powers and so on. And so therefore there was distance between these dictators as rulers, and yet there was a closeness between these dictators and their foreign sponsors. And this is the age of neo-colonialism, where the West didn't have to send armies anymore, and yet could control those states and their economies through these dictators. And of course, these dictators needed support, such as weapons, so the West would still be sending them all kinds of weapons. And as what we discussed earlier, as the strong point where the Muslim lands felt behind the West was in terms of their military power, and so they were also willing to import these. Now, the end result is that when in the post-World War II or European War, there was a call for the self-determination of the nations of the world, and that many of these colonies had to become independent states. Their independence was in a way in name, because that independence did not necessarily mean economic independence. And in many cases, it didn't even mean political independence. And it certainly did not mean military independence. in all three ways, these countries were still dependent on Western powers. We could call this perhaps the beginning of the neocolonialism, is that these heads of states became proxies for Western interests against their own people. And it's in that regard where what is happening now in the Middle East is that the role of most of these seemingly powerful statesmen is simply to serve as managers for Western corporations. And by managers, I mean literally. It's many of these Arab heads of states are managers because how much they produce, in spite of the fact that they have organizations such as the OPEC, that what they essentially produce had to be, say, the price fixing or the deciding on the price would depend on whether a particular price supports their economy at home or Western economies. And my hunch is that in most cases they support Western economies. Take the current situation, for instance, in Saudi Arabia, that because the Americans wanted to punish the Russians in respect to their policies in the annexation of Crimea and in the Ukraine proper, and the Russians could do that. The Russians are showing their muscle because their economy is picking up steam because the oil prices are high. And Russia gets a lot of income, of course, from the export of their oil. And so the West decided, probably the United States decided, to punish Russia. And the only way it could do was to somehow lower, to create a situation where the price of oil would be lowered, so that Russia's income will be affected. And this could be done only by flooding the market. And so if the Saudis are flooding the market to break the back of the Russian economy for the sake of the United States, what do you think is happening to Saudi's own economy, which in terms of its own income is in pretty bad shape? I heard that they have budget deficits in the last 1 or 2 years, and they as the world's largest producers of oil should not have this problem. It's a country with a small population and with a lot of resources that are always in demand. So even if they would sell it at the fair market, they should be making more money. But they have to sell it below the market to flood the market so that their boss in Washington can benefit from the flooding of the market, so that the American rival over in Moscow can lose profit because of the flooding of the market from which the Russians are, getting their major share of their economic income. So, after discussing the economics, the business, the trade, and the colonial policies, and the various things that helped Europe rise to prominence as a global power, as a global center of all sorts of activity, which legitimizes the term the Western civilization, whether you want to add the term Christian to it or not, that doesn't matter. That the Western civilization is the result of those 4 factors we just discussed. And because of their prominence, their rivals, which again in the traditional sense are the Muslims, are suffering a great deal. in terms of how they are perceived around the world, as because it's that negative perception is primarily a Western perception of the Muslim, of Islam. Now, we cannot ignore what the Muslims themselves are doing as they are struggling with their own identity, and they are struggling with how they ought to be defined and the rest of it. So yes, we cannot blame everything on the West. The Muslims, many of the people themselves, the extremists in particular, are responsible for a whole lot of this negative image. But the drama that is being played on the world stage, this drama is staged by the West. Yes, we have Muslim players that play the role of the villains and the vilified in the eyes of the world, and that of course tarnishes the image of the Muslims around the world, equating them to terrorists. But we should never forget that there are hands behind the scene that kind of wind these dolls that play on these stages. And that is our discussion today for how the perception of Islam had turned so negative in the world, especially in the last few centuries. I hope that I've been able to express my opinions as objectively as possible, but I do look forward to any feedback from you, and please do get in touch with me through email and the other media, so that I could address and accommodate your concerns on these various issues, especially in respect to the last several sessions that we discussed the perception of Islam in the world. We came to the end of this session. I hope that you have learned something, and I look forward to learning from you through your feedback. Have a nice day.